Picture a Viking. What comes to mind? Probably a big, burly warrior with a tangled beard, covered in dirt and grime from their latest raid, right? This image of the unkempt, savage Norseman has been plastered all over pop culture for decades. But what if I told you that this popular image is almost completely wrong? What if the Vikings were actually some of the cleanest, most well-groomed people of their time? It sounds crazy, but stick with me, because today we're diving into the surprisingly sophisticated world of Viking hygiene. The stereotype of the dirty Viking probably comes from a few places. First, their main chroniclers were the monks and clerics in places like England and France, the very people whose monasteries they were raiding. Naturally, these writers weren't going to portray their attackers in a flattering light. They described them as savage, godless heathens. Filthy was just another insult to throw on the pile. And let's be honest, life in the early Middle Ages was generally less sanitary than today for everyone. But when you compare the Vikings to their contemporaries, a fascinating picture emerges. Let's start with the archaeological evidence. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have unearthed an astonishing number of personal grooming tools from the Viking Age. We're not talking about one or two items. We're talking about entire sets. These include beautifully crafted combs, tweezers, ear spoons, and even razors. These weren't just crude, functional objects either. Many were made from bone, antler, or ivory, and were intricately carved with complex knotwork and animal designs. People do and put that much effort into making something beautiful if they do and plan on using it frequently and showing it off. A Viking's comb was a personal, prized possession, often worn on a cord around their neck. Why carry a comb everywhere? Because they were using it, constantly. These combs weren't just for looking good. They were practical. They helped detangle hair, style beards, and crucially, get rid of lice and other parasites. In an age before modern medicine, preventing infestations was a major health concern. So a Viking meticulously combing their hair wasn't just being vain. They were practicing preventative health care. Tweezers were used for plucking stray hairs, and the mysterious ear spoon was exactly what it sounds like, a small scoop for cleaning wax out of your ears. It's a bit grim to us, but it shows an attention to personal cleanliness that we don't usually associate with the era. Now let's talk about bathing. Forget the idea of Vikings going months without a wash. Old Norse sagas and poems are full of references to bathing. In fact, Saturday in Old Norse was called lagerdagur, which literally translates to washing day or bath day. This suggests a weekly bathing ritual was a standard part of their culture. This was far more frequent than many other Europeans at the time, for whom a full bath might be a rare yearly event. And they weren't just taking a quick dip in a cold river. The Vikings built bathhouses or saunas, similar to the ones still found in Finland today. They would heat stones in a fire and then pour water over them to create a hot, steamy room. Here, they could sweat out the dirt, relax their muscles, and get properly clean. Afterwards, they might take a refreshing plunge into a nearby lake or even roll in the snow, a tradition that continues in Scandinavia to this day. It was a social event as much as a hygienic one, a place to talk, relax, and wash away the grime of the week. We even have written accounts from outside observers that confirm the Vikings' clean habits. An Arab diplomat named Ibn Fadlan, who met a group of Rus Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century, was both fascinated and slightly disgusted by their morning routine. He described how every morning a servant would bring a large basin of water, and the chief would wash his face and hands, comb his hair, and then blow his nose and spit into the water. Then the basin would be passed to the next person, who did the same thing in the same water, and so on down the line. While sharing bathwater seems unhygienic to us, the key takeaway here is that they were performing a daily washing ritual. They cared enough to wash every single morning, which was certainly not the norm everywhere else. Another account comes from an English churchman, John of Wallingford, who complained bitterly about the Vikings' influence on English women. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the Danish men were winning over noble ladies because they combed their hair daily, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes regularly. He saw their clean habits as a kind of unfair, seductive advantage. They were well-groomed and clean-linned, making the local Anglo-Saxon men look bad in comparison. It's a hilarious complaint that tells you everything you need to know. The locals weren't keeping up, and the clean, fashionable Vikings were stealing their girls. And it wasn't just about being clean. It was about style. Vikings cared a lot about their appearance. They bleached their hair and beards to a fashionable blonde using a strong lye-based soap. This soap not only lightened their hair, but also had the added benefit of killing head lice. So it was both a fashion statement and a practical hygiene measure. Men styled their hair and beards in intricate braids. Some even shaved the back of their heads, leaving a long fringe and beard in the front, a sort of reverse mullet. Women wore their hair long, often in elaborate braids and knots, sometimes held in place with silk ribbons imported from as far away as Byzantium. They also used makeup. Both men and women used a form of eyeliner called kohl. It was a dark powder, often made from ground antimony or lead sulfide, that they would apply around their eyes. This would have made their eyes stand out, reduced sun glare similar to how athletes use eye black today, and according to some beliefs, may have had magical protective qualities. Again, we see this blend of the practical, the cosmetic, and the spiritual. So, where did our image of the dirty Viking come from? As mentioned, it's partly propaganda from their enemies. But it's also a misunderstanding of their daily life. Yes, they were farmers, sailors, and warriors. Life was tough, and they definitely got dirty. A Viking coming home from a raid or a long sea voyage would have been filthy. But the evidence strongly suggests that one of the first things they would do upon returning home is head for the bathhouse, put on clean clothes, and comb their hair. The clothes themselves were another key element. Unlike the drab, brown rags we see in movies, Vikings loved color. They used natural dyes from plants and minerals to create clothes in vibrant shades of red, blue, yellow, and green. Wool and linen were the main fabrics, and wealthier individuals would also have imported silk. Keeping these clothes clean was a chore, but their regular washing day shows they made the effort. So, the next time you see a movie or a TV show depicting a Viking warrior caked in mud with a matted beard, you can smile to yourself, knowing the reality was likely very different. The historical Viking was probably cleaner, more stylish, and smelled a whole lot better than the Anglo-Saxon monk who was writing about how terrible they were. They were people who took pride in their appearance, understood the basics of hygiene, and created a culture where being clean was the norm. It is a fascinating correction to a long-held stereotype and makes these legendary figures from the past feel that much more human and relatable. They weren't just savage raiders. They were also the trendsetters of the early Middle Ages. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Viking hygiene. If you found this surprising, hit that like button and subscribe for more historical deep dives. What other historical myths should we bust? Let me know in the comments below. See you next time. Eric and Sigrid didn't know they were part of something bigger. They didn't know their children's children would survive when cities turned into graveyards. But in 859 AD, something happened that would test everything they believed. A ship arrived from the south. The men on board were dying, and they brought something with them, something that didn't care about soap, something that spread faster than fever, something that would force Eric to choose between his family and his humanity. The ship arrives, late autumn, 859 AD. The wind changed on a Tuesday. Eric felt it first, a shift in the air, a warmth where there should have been frost. October in Norway meant biting cold and early snow. But this year, the gods had sent something else. A thick, unnatural fog rolled in from the sea, and through it a ship emerged. Not a Viking longship. This one was smaller, heavier, with a rounded hull and a single tattered sail. It limped toward the shore like a wounded animal, listing to one side, oars dragging uselessly in the water. Bjorn, now 28 years old and a father himself, spotted it first from the hill where he watched for raiders. "Father," he called down to the village. A ship. Eric, now 52, with gray in his beard and stiffness in his knees, climbed the hill slowly. He squinted toward the water. "That's no Norse ship," he said quietly. "That's Frankish." By the time the ship scraped onto the rocky shore, a crowd had gathered. 20 villagers, mostly men, some women, all armed with axes or knives. Strangers meant danger. Strangers meant raids. But the men on that ship weren't raiders. They could barely stand. The first one to stumble onto the sand was young, maybe 20 years old, with pale skin and hollow eyes. His lips were cracked. His clothes were stiff with dried sweat and worse. He opened his mouth to speak, and then he collapsed. Bjorn moved forward to help, but Eric's hand shot out. "Stop. Father, he's dying. Look at his skin." Bjorn looked. Under the boy's tunic, where the fabric had pulled away, his chest was covered in red welts. Not cuts, not bruises, something else. Something that looked like insect bites, but wrong, clustered, angry. And in the crease of his arm, a swelling, dark, the size of an egg. Sigrid, now 48, had seen sickness before. She had held dying children. She had washed feverish men. But when she stepped onto that beach and looked at the strangers, something in her chest went cold. "Get them to the longhouse," one of the younger men shouted. "Build a fire. They need warmth." "No," everyone turned. Sigrid's voice was quiet, but it cut through the wind like a blade. "They don't get near the village. Woman, they're dying. They don't get near the village." Eric stepped to his wife's side. He didn't speak. He just stood there, axe in hand, and stared at the crowd. One by one, the villagers backed away. They built a shelter at the edge of the fjord, a crude thing of driftwood and old sailcloth, far from the longhouses, far from the children, far from the goats and the grain stores. Sigrid went alone. She took soap. She took boiled water. She took clean cloth. She washed the strangers, one by one. 7 of them total. 2 were already dead by the time she reached them. 3 more were burning with fever, their skin hot to the touch, their eyes unfocused. The young one, the first to fall on the sand, watched her with desperate, pleading eyes. "Please," he whispered in broken Norse. "My sister. She's on the ship. Please." Sigrid stopped. She hadn't seen a woman. Hadn't looked. She walked to the ship, climbed aboard, and found her in the cargo hold. A girl, no more than 12 years old, curled in a corner, shivering, alone. Her skin was clean. No welts, no fever. Just fear. Sigrid carried her off the ship, wrapped her in wool, and brought her to the shelter. That night, the wind died completely. The fog thickened until you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The air grew heavy, damp, and still. Inside the village, families huddled together, whispering. Outside, in the shelter, Sigrid sat with the Frankish girl and watched the men die. The first one went just after midnight. He convulsed twice, then stopped breathing. The swelling in his armpit had grown to the size of a fist, black and hard. The second died at dawn. The third lasted until noon. By evening, only 2 remained, the young man who had spoken and one other. The young man's fever had broken, but he was weak, too weak to move, too weak to eat. The other? He didn't move at all, but he was still breathing. Barely. Sigrid washed them again, changed their bandages, boiled more water. For the first time in her life, it didn't matter. Here's what Sigrid missed, hidden in the cargo hold of that Frankish ship. Buried under sacks of grain and bundles of cloth was a small clay pot, and inside that pot, a family of rats. They had crawled aboard 3 weeks earlier in Paris, where the streets ran with filth and the dead were buried in shallow graves. They had nested in the grain, read in the dark, and fed on the bodies of the sick. When the ship beached in Rogaland, they didn't stay on board. They swam, they climbed, they ran. And by the time Sigrid carried the girl off the ship, those rats were already in the village. 5 days later, a child died. His name was Leif. He was 4 years old, the son of a goatherder named Olaf. He had never gone near the shelter, never touched the strangers, never seen the Frankish ship, but he had played in the grain store. And in the grain store, there was a rat. Leif woke on the 5th night screaming. His mother found him drenched in sweat, his tiny body shaking, his skin burning. She held him, rocked him, sang to him. By morning, the swelling had appeared. By noon, he was gone. Olaf carried his son's body to the edge of the village and stood there, silent for hours. When he finally moved, he didn't go home. He walked to Eric's door. "You brought this," he said. His voice was flat, empty. "Your wife, your strangers, you brought this." Eric said nothing. "Give me the girl." "No." Olaf's hand went to his axe. Behind him, 3 other men stepped forward. Fathers, brothers, men who had lost nothing yet. But fear was already spreading through the village, faster than any sickness. "Give me the girl," Olaf repeated, "or we burn the shelter ourselves." That night, Eric stood between 2 worlds. Behind him, his wife, his son, his grandchildren, and a terrified Frankish girl who had done nothing wrong. In front of him, his neighbors, his friends, men he had known for 40 years. And between them, a line that was about to be crossed. "I'll make you a deal," Eric said quietly. Olaf waited. "Let me take them to the island. The island. A small, barren rock in the middle of the fjord, half a mile from shore. No shelter, no fresh water, no firewood. It's winter," Olaf said. "I know. They'll die. I know." Eric looked back at his longhouse. Through the crack in the door, he could see the Frankish girl, huddled against Sigrid, her small hands wrapped around a cup of goat's milk. "If they stay here," Eric said, "we might all die. You know I'm right." Olaf didn't answer. "But if I take them to the island," Eric continued, "and they survive, you leave them alone, forever. And if they don't survive," Eric met his eyes, "then you'll have your answer." At dawn, Eric loaded a small boat. Sigrid insisted on coming. So did Bjorn, and the Frankish girl, whose name they finally learned, Elara. The young man, her brother Theodric, was too weak to walk. Bjorn carried him to the boat like a child. They took soap. They took wool. They took a small sack of dried fish and a skin of water. They did not take enough. As the boat pushed away from shore, Eric looked back at the village he had lived in his entire life. The longhouses, the smoke, the people. No one waved. No one called out. They just watched. And in one of those longhouses, hidden in the dark, a rat crawled across a sleeping child's face. On that island, with winter closing in and nothing but rock and wind, Eric's family will face something worse than plague, starvation, freezing, madness, and a secret. Theodric hasn't told them, a secret about what really happened in Paris and why that ship was running. The first night, they built a windbreak from driftwood. The second night, the windbreak collapsed. By the 3rd morning, frost covered everything, the rocks, the wool, the skin of the living. Elara woke screaming, her small fingers frozen into claws, her lips blue. Sigrid held her, rubbed her hands, breathed on them, but the cold didn't care. They had brought flint and steel. Bjorn gathered the only dry wood on the island, a few branches washed ashore months ago, brittle, but burnable. The fire lasted 4 hours. Then the wood ran out. They burned the boat next. Not all of it, just the top planks, the ones they could tear free without sinking what remained. The flames leaped high, hot and desperate. For one night they were warm. The next morning, Bjorn looked at what was left of the boat and said nothing. Theodric was dying. Not from plague, his fever had broken days ago, but the swelling in his arm had burst open during the crossing, leaving a wound the size of a coin, wet and red and wrong. Sigrid cleaned it twice a day. She boiled seawater for salt. She tore strips from her own tunic for bandages. But the wound grew. By day 5, Theodric couldn't lift his arm. By day 7, the redness had spread to his shoulder. By day 9, he looked at Sigrid with hollow eyes and whispered, "Leave me." She didn't answer. Bjorn tried to fish. He had no hook, no line, no net. He carved a spear from driftwood and stood for hours in the freezing water, waiting. Nothing. He tried again the next day. Nothing. On the third day, he saw a seal on the rocks, fat, warm, alive. He crept toward it, spear raised, heart pounding. The seal slipped into the water before he got close. That night, they divided the last of the dried fish. 12 pieces, 4 people. 3 days, if they were careful. They had fresh water for 2 days. Then the skin ran dry. Bjorn climbed the highest rock and scraped frost into a cloth. They squeezed it into Alara's mouth. Drop by drop, it wasn't enough. On day 11, Sigrid made a decision. She walked to the shore, filled a small pot with seawater, and set it over the last of the fire. She watched it boil, watched the steam rise, watched the salt settle at the bottom. She dipped her finger in the condensed water on the lid. Fresh, clean, alive. For 3 days, this worked. Then the fire died, and the frost stopped coming. On day 14, Bjorn saw something across the fjord. Smoke, not from the village, from the hills beyond. Thin, distant, but real. "Someone's out there," he said. Eric squinted. "Hunters. Maybe trappers. Should we signal them?" "And tell them what? That we're the ones who brought plague to their families?" Bjorn fell silent. They watched the smoke until it faded at dusk. No one came. That night, Sigrid sat alone at the water's edge. She had a block of soap in her hands, the last one, half-used, rough against her palms. She had brought it to wash the strangers, to save them. Now the strangers were dying anyway. She thought of Leif, the 4-year-old boy, the swelling, the screaming. She thought of the rats she hadn't seen. She thought of her grandmother's words, spoken decades ago. "You can wash the body, child, but you can't wash the world." For the first time in her life, Sigrid understood. Theodric stopped breathing just before dawn. Bjorn found him first, still, cold, his wound-blackened arm stretched out as if reaching for something. He didn't wake the others. He just sat there, staring at the body of a man he'd never wanted on his shore. When the sun rose, Eric asked, "What do we do with him?" No one answered, because the ground was frozen solid. They had no tools to dig, no wood to burn, no strength to carry him anywhere, so they covered him with rocks and tried not to look. 3 people now, an old man, a healer, a boy who had once been strong, and a girl, Alara, who hadn't spoken in 3 days. The dried fish was gone. The last water was gone. The fire was gone. And across the fjord, the village of Rogaland waited in silence, unwilling to help, unable to forget. How long can a body last without food? How long can hope last without reason? And what would you do if the only way to survive was to become someone you never wanted to be?